I'm Barbara Mead. I'm one of the founders of Politics and Prose, and I'm here this evening to introduce Scott Timberg, who has a new book called Culture Crash. I initially heard about this book when Scott's father, Robert Timberg, was here last year talking about his memoir, Blue-Eyed Boy. And so I heard at that time that the book was in the works. But it was only a couple of weeks ago when the book was published that I was at last able to read it, and I enjoyed it immensely. For 6 years, Scott was the arts reporter and a cultural blogger for the LA Times. But in 2008, after the Times was sold to a new owner who had his eyes very much on the bottom line, Scott lost his job first, and then he lost his house in a bank foreclosure. Nevertheless, these losses did not diminish his love for film, books, music, and his writing on the culture class, especially its supporting cast, which he defines as booksellers, DJs, theater set designers, and editors in publishing houses. And the writing that he has done on those has appeared in Salon, the LA Magazine, and the New York Times. I just love the amount, I told Scott, I just love the amount of attention he gives in this book to booksellers as cultural emissaries. They truly are. I was just telling him that I've told many who have said that they were leaving here to go to graduate school that if they stayed here, they would learn much more than they would ever learn in graduate school. And that has turned out to be true for many people. Scott quotes from another author, Richard Russo, in his book, and he writes, "Bookstores are the physical manifestation of the world's longest, best, most thrilling conversation." I want to tell you a little anecdote about one man's progress through the cultural hierarchy that started here at Politics and Prose. About 20 years ago, a young man came here. His name is David Patterson, as a novice bookseller. He stayed for about 5 or 6 years, and he became so good at his job that he outgrew his job, and he went on to become an editor at 2 prominent publishing houses in New York City. And then he was so good at that job that he outgrew it and went on to become a literary agent. A literary agent that represented literary fiction and what he called idea-driven nonfiction. And it was in that role as a literary agent, David Patterson found the manuscript for Culture Crash, found Scott Timberg. And so our bookseller, who was here 20 years ago, is the literary agent on this book. So it has come full circle. So that's another reason why that I'm especially delighted to welcome Scott Timberg. So here is Scott to talk about his new book. Thank you, Scott.
All right, so let me give you, this is yours, right?
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you'll be needing that, I think. And I'll be needing this. I'm going to run a timer so I don't overstay my welcome. Hello, hello, hello. I am probably more a Coltrane than a Miles Davis, so I'm going to try to reel it in and not go past the 25 minutes. And first of all, thanks to everybody for coming here. There's a number of people. I mean, I grew up not far from here in Anne Arundel County, and there's some old friends from even elementary school here today, I think. So I really appreciate everybody coming out tonight. Let me get some water. So I'm gonna rant for about 20 or 25 minutes. Then we're gonna do about the same period for questions, and then I'll sign afterwards. You guys probably know how it works here. So. I'm not an investigative reporter, but there's a term that they sometimes use that has some meaning to me for this project. That's that that you follow a story and just see where it leads, or you follow your nose. It's the famous version of this is Woodward and Bernstein. They talked about follow the money. So when I got a sense that something was wrong, I wanted to follow the money, but I also wanted to follow the ideas. The sort of flow of ideas, see where they took me, and I ended up places I really didn't expect to go. I asked questions from I asked the smartest people I knew questions to help unravel what was going on. And at a certain point, it became sort of like a murder mystery, but not a simple, clean one. It was more sort of like, say, a Ross Macdonald private eye novel where some of the good guys end up being the bad guys, and you see the roots of the crime go back 3 generations. It became extremely complicated, and I realized too that the body floating in the pool dead was me and almost everybody I knew. I had so I'm gonna stop being abstract for a second and tell you the world that I'm describing, why I wrote the book, why I think this is important, and why I find all these calls that we live in the best of all possible worlds, that capitalism is perfect, that the marketplace is a magical thing, that the internet has made every aspect of our life better, why this has struck me as bogus. So here are a few things that that I bring as evidence to the case. So because we're sitting in one of the best independent bookstores in the country, I'll start with this one. The population of the United States has grown by 60 million people since the mid-90s. That's larger than the population of England. In that time, since that time, the country has grown. We have approximately half as many independent bookstores as we had then. Nashville, the capital of country music, has lost 80% of its songwriters since the year 2000. From 2007 to 2014, Hollywood studio musicians saw their income cut in half. Jobs in architecture fell by almost 30% in the 3 years after the 2008 market crash. Newspapers cut 40,000 jobs in those 3 years. The number of English majors graduating from Yale has declined by 60% over the last 20 years. Yale, a legendary department, and for me, this is especially poignant and tangible. Since 2000, nearly 80% of reporters and critics covering the arts and culture for print publications have lost their jobs. I was one of them. I'm in that 80%. So my conclusion, and I'll back up and tell you how I got there. But the key idea of my book, you're gonna, in the age of the internet, all this misinformation, all this flat Earth nonsense floats around, and conspiracy theories and other sort of bogus stuff. So you're gonna hear all kinds of lies and distortions about my book. But people will say, and they already have, that you hear there's this guy saying that the culture's over, that the book publishers are going to stop publishing, that music is going to die tomorrow, that there'll be no more art in this country. I'm not saying that. Here's my driving idea. It's that when artists and craftsmen can't make a living, we all pay the price. That's what my book is about, and I'll try to walk you through that a little bit. All right. So like the rest of you probably, I watched a series of strange things happen over the last, say, 15 years. They made me vaguely uneasy, but it wasn't clear that they had that much to do with me. I didn't feel sort of called to action in any kind of way. I read the stories about how the middle class was shrinking, how median income had peaked in the 70s, how the 1% was capturing a larger and larger slice of American wealth and British, and to some extent in the entire sort of Western world. I heard about the year 2000 about how musicians were seeing their earnings cut. Record companies were being slaughtered by piracy and file sharing, Napster, and things like that. So, I think record industry revenues are less than half what they were in 1999. This made me, to have musicians, I love music. It was probably the first art form I ever loved. My parents turned me on to the Beatles and Dylan when I was young, and I became a big jazz fan. To have this, and I, again, as a journalist, I've known a lot of these people. that troubled me, but I kind of, what can you do? These are technological shifts. Maybe they're just like the blacksmith or the any other kind of outdated figure. I watched bookstores in Los Angeles and environs where I live close. I had an interest, I write about in the book, an interest in people who work in these places, because a bookstore, a record store, a video store is full of people who've chosen to make this part of their life. They're people who want to be surrounded by this stuff. And I did a series of stories on record stores in Los Angeles, including a Tower Classical, which was as big as this store, nothing but classical music up on Sunset Boulevard, basically on the Sunset Strip, that was well-traveled, well-liked bookstore with these real savants behind the counter. And I did that story partly because I realized these people were an endangered species, and they were important to me. I wanted to get to know them and bring them to my readership. Within a year or two of that story, Tower collapsed. All these people lost their jobs. I had worked at a record store, at a Tower in Annapolis in my sort of post-college period, so that was poignant to me. All of this stuff mattered to me, but it started getting closer and closer. I was at the LA Times starting in 2002, and almost as soon as I got there, the paper, which was owned by this sort of numbskull corporation called Tribune, started laying people off in waves, 100 at a time, or 80, or sometimes a couple hundred. These were friends and colleagues. These were very talented people. This was happening, by the way, this was not the recession. This was during good economic times. There were, incidentally, because because the bankruptcy of Tribune ended up opening the books on this, these were times when these corporations, Tribune and others, Gannett, were making money hand over fist. They had enormous profit margins, in the 20 and 30% in some cases. David Simon, the Wire creator, former Baltimore Sun writer, has written very well about this stuff. So even during robust economic times, these papers were laying people off rapidly. Not one, but 3 editors of the LA Times, the top person, one after the other, resigned because they didn't want to cut into bone. They refused and they quit. One was John Carroll, former Baltimore Sun editor. Another is Dean Baquet, who has since bounced back. He's running the New York Times. He's a top editor at the New York Times now. He was the first black editor of the LA Times ever, and a great journalist. And these people said, no, I'm not going to slaughter my staff, and step down. But the slaughtering continued. So this, I lived through 6 or 7 of these waves. But it became really personal for me when I became one of the people who lost his job. I had just talked to a senior editor about how productive I'd been. I nodded, thank you, sir, when he told me he liked my work. I got a small raise. A few weeks later, I was called into another editor's office. A woman with a clipboard and Sarah Palin glasses told me I had till 5 o'clock to clear out my office. I had to sign something saying that I would never come back to the Times newsroom again. That was a place I had worked longer than any other place in my life, longer than I was in college, longer than my high school, longer than any other job. I could never come back, even for social purposes. I could never work for a Tribune property again. I could never work for, say, the Baltimore Sun, which had been my dad's paper, a place where I had been an intern. And I would get a few weeks of severance, and I would get a free resume writing workshop. Now, the world economy, thanks to the actions of banks and the financial class and deregulation and a lot of other nonsense, the world economy was teetering at this point. So having a resume writing workshop offered to me gratis didn't really give me confidence that I was going to get out of this alive. So it was a really confusing time for me. A lot of other people. In 2008, Lehman Brothers had failed. It wasn't clear if we had another 1929 coming or just how this was going to end. It was becoming an international crisis. It was an absolute mess. So we were all, I had been basically drop-kicked, and so would a lot of other people. The people I knew in Los Angeles and elsewhere. And I don't just mean journalists. I had friends who were animators who lost their jobs. Again, musicians, people who worked in art galleries. My best friend was a landscape painter. He didn't have a job, but he had people who were buying his paintings of Southern California until they didn't, until this all collapsed. So I started to see how widespread this was. And when I came up for air, I realized two things. I sort of gradually started to get a sense of what was sort of a hint of what was going on. And I realized two things. First of all, the musician who I was sort of passively concerned about when he or she went from being able to make a living from their art and suddenly couldn't, the dude at the bookstore who I thought was really smart and had read way more than me and could turn me on to things I didn't know about that didn't have corporate marketing behind it, the woman at the record store who introduced me to some obscure jazz records. I realized that all this stuff, the architect I knew whose firm was collapsing, and he and his wife were a super talented couple who ran a small green firm and did work for filmmakers and so on. Their firm went down, their marriage started to fall apart. I realized that all this stuff was connected, that there was the same kind of forces sweeping across the Anglo-American world. I also realized that as this became very acute for me and other people, and I'm talking about job losses, serious depression, marriages being destroyed, companies failing. I mean, in California, the unemployment rate was 12% for a long time, and for the creative class, it was even higher. I realized that this was pretty serious business for me and a lot of other people, but I wasn't hearing about it. NPR wasn't doing stories on it. The newspapers weren't. Vanity Fair was still running, big ads for fancy watches and stories about British royalty. If you did get stories on the recession was bad, there's unemployment, there was some good reporting on it. But as far as members of the creative class, however you define the term, and I defend it in a perhaps idiosyncratic way, but if you're talking about people who work in culture, people who work in journalism, people like the people around you in this bookstore, we were not hearing about what they were going through. We weren't hearing about what the world they represented were going through. So that's when I realized that I wanted to figure out what the hell had happened, because I was mostly just confused, and I wasn't hearing about it from anywhere else. I called an editor or two and thought, would it be interesting for your readers at this magazine or this paper to hear what it's like for not just a steel worker, not just a working class person, but someone who has master's degrees, did 3 unpaid internships, thought he had paid dues to get into a profession, who's going through something that had been sort of a working class thing for a generation or two. And I didn't just mean me. I said, let's look at writers, musicians, et cetera, who were going through this, who had made sort of risk-averse choices to avoid this sort of nonsense. And I was told that could be a really interesting story if you write about the fact that your layoff was the best thing that ever happened to you. Like, could you do kind of a counterintuitive thing? And or how about your layoff allows you to pursue your plan B, like you'd always wanted to climb the Himalayas or something like that. And I thought, Jesus, I have a small child. I have a house that I bought in a ridiculous housing market. My wife is a school librarian. Because of the austerity and the cuts to public funding, she lost her job every year. The 5 years after the recession, she got it back just in the nick of time. But I mean, we came within 2 weeks of losing medical insurance for the whole family, again, including our I think he was 3, our 3-year-old son. You want me to write a damn story about how fucking great this is? It was all I was hearing from the gatekeepers in journalism. I think these people didn't want to be navel-gazing, narcissistic, we can't write about ourselves. But at a certain point, we start to ignore larger realities because you're trying to be counterintuitive, trying to be clever. You're not giving an honest picture of how the world is really built. And again, that's what I tried to do with this book. So when I try, in my aim to sort of try to figure this out, again, there's about 4 pages or something in the book that are about me. The book isn't really about me. It's about kind of a larger crisis and trying to figure a way out of it. So I needed to talk to other people. I talked to approximately 100 people. Some of them end up in the book, some don't. Some of them were people who'd been through things like me. Some of them were economists, historians, musicians, etc., scholars. I read tons of articles. I read about 100 books, books on the internet, books on economics, cultural histories of the cultural impulse going back to the Neolithic age, social criticism, Barbara Ehrenreich's books, Thomas Frank's books, older 50s social criticism, et cetera, and I realized there were 3 main elements to what we were, and this is what my book concentrates on. One aspect of this is economic. It's the recession. It's the rise of the 1%. It's the march of inequality. It's the crushing of the middle class. It's the Reagan Revolution. It's what the economist Simon Johnson calls the quiet coup by the very rich against the lower sort of 99.5%. I realized, I didn't expect to, but I realized as I dug into this that while we hear about really famous, superstars, when it comes to artists and writers and cultural people, we hear in the media almost exclusively about superstars. I don't mean there's anything unfair about what the media does. It's just the way the press and magazines and radio operate. You also have this myth that goes back to 19th century Paris of the artist as a sort of gutter-dwelling bohemian who sort of passed out from a wild night of absinthe swilling, right? And I was in Baltimore the other day, home of Edgar Allan Poe. It's not like there are no examples of this. Just like, Kanye West really does make a lot of money, and he's a kind of, sort of god now. So is Taylor Swift. There's some really rich people in the arts. They tend to be the ones who get the coverage, and we've got this sort of lingering thing that, well, artists really need to suffer. Isn't that kind of the way they sort of find their voice? The fact is the creative class, I don't just mean the creators of the art, but I mean the supporting cast who in their way are just as important, the art critic of the newspaper, the person at the bookstore, a musician's manager or publicist. If those people often get a bad rap, but they're important to keep this rolling. An art teacher, frankly, is crucial. Or, literature teacher, crucial to this whole ecosystem as well. The creative class is largely, overwhelmingly, a subset of the middle class. You don't hear about these people very much, but in fact, the overlap is almost complete. And the forces acting on the middle class and hollowing it out, the sort of grand American middle class that was effectively built by post-war prosperity and by FDR in the 30s and by regulations and things like that, didn't just evolve naturally. It was something that we as a country and Europe and Britain decided was important. And because of that, they grew this class, sustained it. In the 70s and 80s, it started to be chipped away. It still exists, but it's shrinking every year. Canada now has a more robust middle class than ours. Our middle class has seen its median income decline even during the economic recovery. So forget about the recession, which wasn't a good time for anybody. In the economic recovery, all of the gains are going to the very rich. The middle class continues to wither and shrink. So economics was a big part of this. Technology was as well, the digital world, the internet, Amazon putting bookstores out of business, file sharing, sort of a euphemistic term. It's almost like, what do they call it? Enhanced interrogation or something like that. It's one of the sort of weaselly, sort of Orwellian terms, but file sharing basically means, ripping off musicians. So the digital world has done a lot of good things. It's made some things more convenient, but if you're a musician, a writer, etc., it's destroying the ecosystem, and it's destroying your class basically if you exist in any of those forms. Don't believe the hype that musicians just need to adjust, that musicians can tour and make all their money on touring. There's a lot of nonsense coming out of Silicon Valley about how people just need to get with it, and there's so much money out there. Musicians just need to get off the couch and harness it. It's nonsense, but you're going to keep hearing it for years and years because these Silicon Valley people who work for corporations that are as large as Saudi Arabia are making money hands over fist off the work of writers, musicians, graphic artists, photographers, etc. They have enormous lobbying budgets, huge. The independent artist doesn't. So these myths and lies are going to continue to proliferate. So get used to it. I mean, I'm waiting for my book to be destroyed by technological utopians. It hasn't happened yet, but there's already a buzz on the internet with various sort of ridiculous charges, and that'll just that goes with the territory these days. The third and to me kind of most interesting and least tangible, least talked about of these is what I call social norms. It sort of shifts in the way we think about the arts and culture, and it involves sort of, you could also call it sort of the category you could call sort of bad ideas. It's sort of the way that our thinking, and I don't mean I mean sort of our unconscious thinking, our kind of assumptions about society, art, childhood, schooling, etc. And for example, I'm talking about this sort of disenchanting of the notion of culture, the idea that culture is exclusively about money, the idea which goes back to Andy Warhol and French theorists and the school of thought that calls itself postmodernism, that says that literature, art, culture is not a transcendent road to wisdom. It has to do nothing. It has to do with nothing except PR. That it's about power relations exclusively. That it's sort of a sham job. There's a series of ideas that spread out of France and the academy, and they've done an enormous amount of damage. I get into it in depth in the book. There's a kind of psychological conquest by the marketplace, the idea that buying and selling is all that matters, and that culture needs to wake up and get part of that. That if a symphony doesn't earn the same amount of money as a as a fast food restaurant, that has somehow failed. It's sort of a neoliberal argument about any kind of support for the arts and culture. So these are things that have changed over the last few decades, and they were harder to figure out and describe, but they struck me as crucial. The loss of the sense that there was something sacred about the arts and culture, that there was something, again, transcendent or wise or morally complex and nourishing about it. That idea is probably something that we in this room share, but it's become a real minority kind of notion. So all of these things were kind of isolated, independent factors that kind of came together accidentally and by happenstance to in the 21st century kind of erode the creative class. There was no conspiracy against us. It was just a bunch of forces that were on their own. They were kind of all on their own orbit. And because they came together, it made the crisis deeper and worse, and it's making it harder to get out of. I guess I'll just close, and we're going to do questions in a minute. I'll just close by saying, one of the sort of disses on my book is that, it's a depressing book, or it's just full of bad news or something. First of all, I think uncomfortable truths are important, no matter, whether they make us feel good or not. We've got to face up to things. If there's a crisis, which I think there is, we're not going to get through it with magical thinking and hype and propaganda. The other thing, though, I had to read this book the way a reader would for proofing purposes, where you read it and you say, there's a typo here. And I read it long after I turned it in. It was like reading somebody else's book, and it made me angry at times. It made me kind of grimly laugh, once or twice. It didn't make me depressed. What I think is important is, and what made me want to write the book, is that, culture matters. Your bookstore matters. To have journalists, the arts people at a newspaper, but also the investigative reporters, people who are fighting to make sure we don't have another Enron, where a corporation fleeces an entire state through blackouts and other sort of nonsense. Okay, and the journalists who are keeping an eye on the corporations, keeping an eye on the State House, the museum that helps people understand a world beyond them, a novel which gives people a sense of a world different than their own. Fiction helps build empathy. These things matter. They're an enormous resource for a democracy and a civilization. I wrote this book because I think that stuff is vastly valuable. It's as valuable as I thought when I was a teenager falling in love with James Joyce and Dylan records and Billie Holiday. And my job is really to fight for it. It's not just about me. I hope that you who listen will take an interest in this, and that we can all somehow do something to bring things forward in a way that revives what I see as a culture crash, and move us into a world where we have a rich, robust culture and a rich, robust creative class. Thank you very much.
I'd like to make a point that hasn't been made, and that is that Scott's speaking here completes a hat trick for the Timberg family. Bob Books has been here for several books. Craig was here for his book a year or so ago. Now Scott, and we should applaud the Timbergs.
Thank you.
Scott, I also not only am getting into the book, but I enjoy your blog about West Coast culture. Tell people about it.
Yeah, right. Thank you. I run a blog called Culture Crash. If you Google my name and the name of the book, you'll see it come up. It's on a larger site called ArtsJournal, and every day, except when I'm on a book tour, I post on these ideas, because this crisis is not just about, again, it's not just about the recession or something. It's about a kind of new world that we're in. It's changing, and there are new sort of outrages and occasionally new signs of hope every day. And I try to follow these things and keep up. So check out the Culture Crash blog if you get a chance. And if somebody doesn't ask a question, I'll probably start ranting again. So please stop me.
So okay, I'll I'm his father. Scott. Hey Scott, the thing that was missing from your talk was essentially, what do we do about it?
Right.
You sort of stated the problem, and then you left us hanging.
Right.
Will you do something about that?
Good question. So each of these, I write about a bunch of different fields here. There's a chapter on rock and roll. There's a chapter on the press. There's a chapter on freelancers. There's architecture, et cetera. Each of these fields has their own kind of has their own solutions. And I have a piece I'm going to run in the next week or two, which will get into some more detail, specific kind of things. But I'll just say in general, this might not need to be said, but I'll say it anyway. If you value something, whether it's a musician, a bookstore, an artist in your town, whatever it is, you don't want to be the kind of person, and I was this kind of person, who says, man, I am really sorry that place closed. I'm really sorry that person had to leave town. That place left, that shop shut down. That newspaper is over. If you don't support these places, if you don't buy a book at an actual brick and mortar bookstore, and spaces, urban spaces are a major part of the story my book tells. If you don't support a bookstore, if you have money and you don't buy a print by an artist, you don't necessarily need to buy a $1,000 piece, but you can buy a lithograph or a print or something. If you don't do that, this ecology is going to continue to wither. So specifically, and that sounds kind of obvious, but it's funny. My wife works at a high school, and if you tell the teenagers, well-meaning smart kids, that they should be paying for music instead of just downloading or listening to it on Spotify or Pandora, they look at you like you're insane. I mean, they have no experience. When I talk about social norms and just kind of sociological changes, which is the hardest part of this to talk about, that's part of what I mean. There's this sort of ideology that's come out of Silicon Valley. They call it the information wants to be free or something. And the cult of free has been as healthy for the creative class as trickle-down economics was for the middle class. It's a sham job, and I urge you to wake up to it if you haven't, and realize that artists and craftsmen need to be paid. More broadly and abstractly, the arts and culture have basically been divorced from the middle class for a few decades. There's a lot of reasons for it. I'll just say most tangibly, it has to do with what I call losing our religion, our sort of loss of faith that the arts and culture were were clarifying, redeeming. We used to talk about the human condition. Now all that stuff is considered this sort of old world nonsense. But because of those things, because of government austerity and anti-intellectualism and so on, the arts have dropped out of public schools, except the very, very wealthiest. If children aren't, I was lucky. First of all, I was the last generation of kids who got some art and music education at a public school. I also had parents who believed in this stuff. I was lucky, but not everybody is. So if you remove that from a school, why should anybody, when they grow up, why should they go to the theater? Why should they support a bookstore? The stuff that I'm talking about here will not resonate with them. And if you don't get it when you're a kid, you probably never will. There are exceptions. If we don't restore the whole infrastructure around the arts, which again starts with education, it also has to do with public funding, et cetera, then we're in real trouble.
Were you aware that last Thursday night's speaker strongly endorsed your book?
No, I was on a plane.
It was titled "The Internet is Not the Answer."
I was busy missing a bus at BWI actually. When what was it?
The Internet is not the answer. And
Andrew Keene, right? Yes, I quote him. He's one of the people I interviewed. I quote him. I've not seen his new book, but he's a smart guy, and I interviewed him briefly for this and quote him.
I'm here because he endorsed your book.
Oh, cool. Well, I'll tip my hat toward Silicon Valley, where he's sort of the kind of rebel prince.
And he emphasized that both your books have a nice yellow cover.
I know. It's funny. I mean, to give you, just some of the people in this room went to my high school, Severna Park High School, or even my elementary school. So this will mean something to them, and if not, I hope it means something to you. My dad is a writer. His father was a vaudeville musician. My mother took us to theater and music and stuff, and it was in the family. But my real entry into the creative class, when I realized this is a group I wanted to be part of, was that my high school had a literary magazine that was called Impulse, and if you flipped it over, it was called Repulse, and it was a satire magazine. I wandered in after school one day as a freshman, and I found these people sitting around a table trying to come up with satire ideas. There was something going on at the school, and we were trying to sort of poke fun at it, and I walked in and slipped in, and I realized, this is what I want to do with my life. And a person who I had known a little bit, a guy named Evan Gaffney, I ended up joining the magazine, becoming an editor and helping to run it. And this guy, Evan, was an illustrator, an artist. He was the kind of kid who all the girls in our class would say, "Evan, can you draw my picture on my notebook?" and that kind of thing. He was very popular among people for sketching things on their trapper keepers and so on. And anyway, Evan illustrated the short stories that I and other people wrote. He illustrated our satire pieces. And when I was at a loss for what to do with the book jacket, Evan helped out. He's a book jacket and record jacket designer in New York. He works for the company Nonesuch a lot, who does John Adams and Magnetic Fields, and he designed this for me. I say all this not just to nod toward Evan, who's a close friend and a wonderful guy, but also to explain that deeper in some ways and more brutal than the world I sketch is what happened in Paris with the attacks on the satire magazine Charlie Hebdo. Working around other writers and satire people was, again, my introduction to this world, is what made me want to do it. So to have intolerant fanatics go into an office and kill writers and cartoonists and so on, it cuts me very close to the bone. It's a terrible thing. What I've been through and my friends in the States and Britain have been through is rough, but that's just vastly more savage than anything that we've been through.
I have a more serious question.
Sure.
We're always told there's a lot of emphasis on something called STEM.
Yeah.
Science, technology, engineering, and math. And emphasize children go take STEM, become a STEM person, even though I fear that STEM jobs are going to communist China.
Yeah.
But
it's the best
or
capitalist
India.
Communist country there is, right?
Right.
I mean,
they don't ask questions and they don't unionize.
Right.
But my
True.
question is, shouldn't it actually be STEAM, science, technology, humanities, arts, and mathematics?
Well, I'm all for that. The problem is, though, again, between sort of economic neoliberalism and this sort of disenchantment that I described, where we've sort of lost faith in the humanities and the arts, unless there's a real movement among educators, politicians, people in general. I mean, part of it is that the creative class needs to stand up for itself and assert why it's valuable. If there's not a movement like that, the humanities will keep dropping out. I mean, English and other majors like that will continue to be marginalized. I guess I wish there was an H in there. I just don't. I just don't see it coming. I don't know that people are going to get angry enough. There's a book coming that I'm looking forward to by a historian. It's called The Age of Acquiescence, and it's about why in the first Gilded Age we had towering inequality, and we got a progressive movement. We had Teddy Roosevelt break up the trusts and fight for the middle and working class. Why is there no serious mass movement in the new Gilded Age that resembles that at all? The energy is really on the right now, and the Tea Party, this most vigorous movement, was a movement that came together originally because of a televised rant against people like me, people who'd lost their houses and who had hoped the government could somehow find a way to negotiate with the banks. So the energy is on the side of the very rich, and the progressive movement has today is a shadow. There's no Teddy Roosevelt in the wings. It's the same thing with culture. There's nobody fighting for the humanities and the arts the way there has been in the past. Until that changes, you're not going to see the H anywhere.
Actually, as part of that question, there actually is some STEAM movement going on among some various groups. There's even a STEAM caucus on Capitol Hill. So it's
Glad to hear it.
It's starting to percolate, but it's still percolating. Another question. I work at the National Endowment for the Arts, and so this is all very, very close to home.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering whether you see a role for either public or private philanthropy funding in addressing these issues.
The simple answer is yes. I mean, we need more public funding. We need more private funding. I mean, the amount to anything helps, but the amount that would make a huge difference in the way arts and culture work would be basically a rounding error on our surveillance budget. We have a bigger military than the next 10 countries put together. And that old line about, to a man with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I mean, we've got a lot of economic incentives out there for military contractors who live in enormous houses, are making money hand over fist to keep this all rolling. And the amount of money that the arts and culture gets is pennies. It's nothing. And some things can survive in the sort of naked marketplace. But even a former NEA chief who I interviewed for the book, Dana Gioia, he's a Republican. He's a former corporate guy. He believes deeply in what's that?
I work for him.
Okay, cool. What's your name?
Victoria.
Oh yeah, sure, cool. Good to meet you. We've corresponded before. I'll tell him hi for you. Anyway, Dana is a Republican, a capitalist, former corporate vice president. Dana says that capitalism works great for some things, for culture and the arts. It's at least imperfect, and certain things like classical music, theater, dance, etc., predate capitalism. They go back before the age of Adam Smith, and they don't fit in that well, and they're going to wither if they don't use a different model. And we're seeing the evidence all around us that he's right. Thank you for your question.
I haven't read the book yet, but
That's okay.
what did you learn about as a potential solution or source about crowdfunding, which is all
Yeah.
the rage?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. The question is, how do I see crowdfunding fitting in? Crowdfunding is things like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, where on the internet people are asked to sort of contribute often small amounts to make, say, a film happen. If enough money accumulates, the film will happen. If it doesn't, the film won't happen, or the whatever the project is. The internet utopians will tell you we don't need the NEA, we don't need public funding, we don't need all the stuff this guy's talking about, because we live in the best of all worlds, and crowdfunding will save us. Crowdfunding has done great things for the makers of really expensive watches. There are a lot of there's a whole site for porn films, that have gotten funded. I mean, there are places where it's been really successful. Otherwise, I find crowdfunding kind of spotty. There have been some. Don't get me wrong, there's been some good things that have happened. There's a film by Stuart Murdoch, the lead singer of Belle and Sebastian, which was crowdfunded, for instance. The problem with it is that crowdfunding, in other words, building support, promising people things that they give enough money, it's like running for office. You put all of your energy into getting there, into wooing people. It's like digital busking, which I think is a term that David Patterson, formerly of Politics and Prose, invented, I think, where you're constantly begging for money. Now, some people are good at that, some people aren't. A lot of artists who I admire, Elizabeth Bishop, the poet, Eric Dolphy, the jazz saxophonist, these people were inward, sort of monastic people who were dedicated to their art. They weren't going to be out there every day tweeting for $5 from everybody to make their record. Not to mention the fact that if you spend all your time raising money or self-promoting, you don't have time to become an artist or to be an artist. I mean, think of say somebody like Jimi Hendrix, the most transformational guitarist in history. Hendrix didn't reimagine the guitar by constantly bugging people on Facebook to give him $5 1,000 times so he could make his record. Despite his reputation as a sort of a wild man, Hendrix was a deeply disciplined guy who did what jazz musicians called woodshedding. He disappeared for years to work on his art. Pretty much every serious artist I know goes through a period of woodshedding where they're alone, concentrating. Maybe they're working at a record store on the way, but they're committing themselves to understanding the language they're working in, the instrument, the genre, the field they're in. They're not constantly begging for money. So some people can make it work, but it doesn't seem to me like a solution. I think we move to this side, right?
I have two parts to my question. One is actually related to some work that the NEA has done on the Cultural Data Project, which is both at the federal and the state level. And the other part is, my first part of my question is, do you think that's valuable to do that kind of work? And is that a good way to support more backing for the arts, both in the public and private sector? And the second part is, what kind of policy do you think is valid for there to be developed in order to push this forward?
Well, I guess, a very important part of this book is looking at the reality of a life in the arts. And the most important study on that was done by the NEA under Dana Gioia. It's called Artists in the Workforce, Workplace. I quote from it in the book. It shows that artists, again, despite the sort of mythology that they're all getting rich and getting rich off the federal dole, which comes out of this sort of cultural elite charge that Nixon and Agnew dreamed up years ago, and Dan Quayle and so on, that artists are actually working very hard for very little money. So that kind of survey, that is the most important survey. It's a few years old now. I wish they would redo it. I've been in touch with the NEA statistics person, the research person. He's great, but we need a new study. Second of all, arts policy, I know that we need more. I'm not an expert on arts policy. I think that arts funding is important. I think that publications need financial support the same way radio in this country has been revived through public funding. How many commercial stations do you know that are a sliver as good as an NPR station? So I think we need more. I'm frankly not an expert on how it works. I know people who know that world better. But again, without it, that sort of, the invisible hand is not going to save us. Let me put it that way.
Okay, we're beginning to run out of time, so we'll do the one question here and one question here.
Hi,
Hey.
I just wanted to say thank you for writing the book, and I haven't read it yet either, but I'm a photographer, and I moved to New York in 1988 and worked like crazy, and I actually studied painting and drawing, and I thought I'm never going to get a job doing that, so I'll try, and I somehow was really successful and got to shoot all kinds of amazing things and really interesting stories and celebrities and interiors and covers of magazines that everybody reads, and then moved to LA after September 11th and lost bought my house in the hills and lost my house and have lots of friends that are photographers and artists and musicians and I've been going crazy since I lost the house in 2010. But my agents were like, you got to work for free now. You got to fly yourself to New York, pay for it. You can work as a local in New York. I mean, it is, and I never saw it coming. My dad was a journalist. I grew up here. My mom was an artist, and I never thought of anything but doing this, and then doing it successfully, and then having a lot of kids come up to me now and ask, how can I be a photographer? I have I don't know I can't find. I haven't been. I mean, I'll be able to sometimes a couple times a year shoot, and I mean, I was booked like traveling the world.
Yeah.
And I've seen it with my friends I don't have children, who had to pull their kids out of schools, and and I feel like I'm going crazy sometimes, because I was really at the top.
It's the hardest thing I've had to do when I've addressed. I taught writing at a college, and I had to give a final, senior week, closing lecture to young students who wanted to become journalists. I had them reading Joan Didion and Richard Ben Kramer and Tom Wolfe and Jane Jacobs, and I had to tell them, what the reality was like, and I didn't want to discourage them because, again, I think this stuff is extremely valuable, but I also know that it was not easy when we were getting in, but it's gotten vastly worse. So it's very tough to know what to say to young people. If they don't have a trust fund, they're taking a real chance, is the simple answer.
And even so, I don't think that like the stories that I used to do, I mean, I would do the celebrities and do interior and pretty stuff and, things that advertising would pay for. But then some of the interesting stories, like they'd send me to a jail, they should, or to go to India for a month, those are just gone.
Yeah, you pay your own way for all that stuff now. Yeah.
And,
it's true for many journalists as well.
And I also think I shot myself in the foot a little bit by shooting for some of the stock agencies like Getty and Corbis, and then now they sell my.
They own your work, and you get nothing.
Each.
Yeah, welcome to the 21st
I used to make
century.
thousands.
Yeah.
Now I make pennies on the picture. And it's just an interesting.
Yep.
I mean, I can't believe it happened.
I hear this from musicians. I hear it from writers. Again, this is why I thought this problem needed to be tackled all at once, because it's the same stuff. No matter what you do, you might make movies, you might write articles. It's all the same stuff right now. So thank you for your interest. Hi, last question. Yeah.
One of the most brilliant and creative partnerships I know of is between the Washington Opera and the Washington Nationals that allows anyone to come to the park to hear the opera twice a year in an effort to get more people to know about and love opera. In the course of writing and researching your book, did you come across any creative solutions to the problems you see?
Well, that's an interesting one. One creative solution, and I'm a journalist who covers this stuff. It has personal meaning to me, but I also need to keep a certain amount of distance. There's a group that I don't always agree with, but and I think they're an important solution, even though I don't think they're perfect. I'm not a member, but it speaks to, in some ways, the last question. It's a group called the Content Creators Coalition. I prefer the word culture to the word content, but that's kind of where we are. We've changed the way we think about this stuff. And Content Creators Coalition is I interview some of them in the book. I talk about them, but basically it's a group that is trying to link creative people across the disciplines. Again, journalists, visual artists, musicians, architects, etc., because independently, we have zero power. And a lot of us are freelancers or isolated independent artists. Individually, we are nothing. I mean, compared to the Wall Street banks and the Silicon Valley tech companies, we don't stand a chance. When policy is written for, say, royalty rates or anything that matters, we don't have a seat at the table. They have lobbyists, they have huge amounts of money. We have nothing. So Content Creators Coalition, and there's another group called Freelancers Union, which is not purely creative class, but helps freelancers come together and negotiate for health care and fair contracts and so on. I think groups like that bring creative people together and can make them, over time, a political force with at least some muscle, get them a seat at the table. I think that's extremely important. And again, I haven't joined the group, but I think that kind of association is crucial if we're going to get out of this morass. Thank you very much for your interest. Okay, appreciate it. Thank you. Good.